On February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, fortunately, all of us haven't been drafted into World War III like many of the memes at the time suggested we would be, but unfortunately, there has been over 500,000 casualties so far caused by the war. According to the United Nations, this includes at least 10,000 civilians killed and at least 500 children. So why did Russia invade Ukraine in the first place? Well, I just finished writing a research paper and I found that there's at least two main reasons for why Russia invaded Ukraine. The first reason being that Putin wants to create a sort of pan-Russian nation, including Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, that solidifies his sphere of influence. And the second reason is that Western nations have caused Putin to feel threatened by pushing to have Ukraine join NATO and the European Union and to take power from Russia. According to Taras Kuzio in his article, Why Russia Invaded Ukraine, he says that Putin's desire to build a pan-Russian nation is a foundational cause of the invasion of Ukraine. Putin has been heavily inspired by people such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn and other white Russian emigres, and these emigres and Solzhenitsyn and Putin hold that Ukraine was formed in order to sap power from Russia. And they believe that this goes all the way back to the 19th century with Austria pushing for Ukrainian independence. And this continued up into the days of the USSR, where Lenin helped establish a semi-independent Ukraine. And then, of course, after the USSR collapsed, Ukraine became its truly own independent nation. Now, Putin has been pushing the idea since he became president in 2012 that Ukraine is a sort of prodigal son of Russia and that Ukrainians are something akin to countrymen of Russians. And according to John Mearsheimer, over 80% of Russians believe this and do see Ukrainians as something akin to fellow countrymen. However, in Ukraine, this idea has become less and less popular, and many Ukrainians do not view themselves as Russian countrymen or Ukrainian countrymen. And this especially is true after Russia invaded Ukraine. They do not see themselves as being fellow Russians. Now, this is a complete change from decades and centuries ago, where many Russians and Ukrainians along the border did view themselves as basically fellow countrymen. This includes my great-grandmother Lydia, who was born in a small village outside Lviv that I cannot pronounce. This is my grandmother Lydia right here. And in many of the letters, or some of the letters written to her family and the stories she told us, sometimes she referred to herself as Ukrainian and sometimes as Russian. So people back then did consider themselves to be, the lines were blurred whether they were Russian or Ukrainian. However, this is no longer true in Ukraine, while it is very true in Russia. So Putin's attempts to bring Ukraine into his sphere of influence that way have largely failed, although Belarus and of course Crimea, which Russia invaded, has been brought into his sphere of influence. So the secondary reason for why Russia invaded Ukraine is he feels threatened by Western influence in Ukraine. According to John Mearsheimer in his article, The Causes and Consequences of the Ukrainian War, NATO enlargement has basically twisted Putin's arm into acting. He feels sufficiently threatened by actions of Western nations in Ukraine to invade Ukraine itself. NATO pushed for Ukraine to join NATO and the European Union by the US and European nations is a primary cause of war stated by Putin to be a reason for him to invade Russia. He, ever since the 90s, not just Putin, but other Russian leaders have been very vocal about the fact that they feel threatened by Western nations to push Ukraine into their sphere of influence, and they've iterated this over and over. However, unfortunately, Western nations have largely disregarded the warning signs. According to Michael McFowle in his article about the causes of the Ukrainian war, dismissal of signs and silly idealism kept US and European leaders from recognizing the trouble they were creating. So this just built up from way back in the 90s all the way up to now. All the way back in 2014 during the Revolution of Dignity, Western nations had an influence in Ukraine that helped cause the removal of the pro-Russian president of Ukraine. And this made Russia feel threatened enough that they felt justified in invading Crimea. However, leaders such as President George Bush and President Barack Obama, as well as leaders of Germany and France, have continued to ignore warning signs and continue to push NATO to accept Ukraine and for NATO to join the European Union. And this has built up over time, all the way up until 2022, where Russia felt sufficiently threatened to again invade Ukraine, but this time on a much larger scale. So in summary, the two main reasons that Russia invaded Ukraine is, one, Russia wants to build a pan-Russian federation or nation from Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And the second reason is that Russia has felt threatened by the push by Western nations to have Ukraine come within their sphere of influence as a member of NATO and the European Union. Now, since the war started, there have been over 1,500 refugees who have been brought by the government to the Raleigh area. So hopefully here they will find peace and will be able to escape the conflict for good. And hopefully they don't have to worry about themselves and all of us getting drafted into World War III and proving all those memes right.